It was a sunny Saturday afternoon, and what should have been a routine trip to the grocery store turned into a moment of chaos and conflict. Daniel Carter, a hardworking man looking to pick up some essentials, found himself in an explosive confrontation far beyond a parking lot dispute. A white SUV screeched to a halt beside him, and its driver, Martha Thompson, emerged, her face twisted with fury. Bookmark, the following argument wasn't just about who got the parking space first. It spiraled into something darker. Insults, physical aggression, and outright destruction. What began as a trivial misunderstanding quickly became a battle over respect, dignity, and accountability. When Martha's entitlement escalated into violence, Daniel was left with no choice but to stand up for himself, setting the stage for a dramatic legal showdown. Before we dive into this gripping story of justice, resilience, and the fight against prejudice, comment below where you're watching from today. And if this tale of courage and conflict already hooks you, don't forget to hit subscribe so you won't miss out on any future stories. Daniel Carter pulled into the crowded parking lot of the local supermarket on a sunny Saturday afternoon. The rows of cars shimmered under the warm sunlight, their polished surfaces reflecting a mixture of blue skies and the occasional cloud. It was the kind of day that invited everyone out to finish errands, and the lot was buzzing with activity. Shoppers weaved between cars, grocery carts rattling on the pavement as they rushed to complete their weekend routines. Navigating slowly down the lane, Daniel scanned for a parking spot. After a few minutes of circling, he spotted one near the entrance, a rare find on a day like this. His face relaxed into a small smile. "Perfect," he murmured as he carefully guided his car into the space, ensuring it was neatly aligned between the lines. Just as Daniel turned off the engine and reached for the door handle, a loud, high-pitched screech of tires pierced the air. Startled, he saw a white SUV barreling into the adjacent spot, coming to an abrupt and aggressive halt. His brow furrowed as he watched the driver, a woman with sharp features and short, perfectly styled blonde hair, roll down her window. "Hey!" she barked, pointing a finger directly at him with an expression of pure outrage. Daniel paused, unsure of what had triggered such aggression. "That was my spot," the woman yelled, her voice laced with anger. Daniel opened his door slowly, stepping out into the bright sunlight. He adjusted his posture, keeping his demeanor calm despite the unexpected hostility. "Excuse me?" he asked, his tone measured and polite. Now slamming her car door shut, the woman stormed toward him. She was of medium height but seemed larger than life, her anger radiating off her like heat waves from asphalt. "I was waiting for that spot," she hissed, standing just inches from him. Her fists were clenched at her sides, and her body language screamed confrontation. Confused, Daniel glanced around. He hadn't seen her car waiting when he parked. The lane had been clear. "I didn't notice anyone waiting," he replied evenly. "The spot looked open when I arrived." Her eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a sneer. "Of course, you didn't notice," she snapped, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. "You people never do you?" Daniel's stomach churned. He recognized the undertone of those words immediately. It wasn't just about a parking spot anymore. It was about something much deeper. Something uglier. He had encountered it in different forms and settings before, but it always left the same bitter taste in his mouth. Taking a steadying breath, Daniel chose to keep his response neutral. "Look, I'm sorry if there was a misunderstanding," he said, calm but firm. "I didn't see you, and I had no intention of taking anything from anyone." His words only seemed to ignite her further. "Don't you dare talk to me like that," she spat, her voice rising with every word. "You people think you can just take whatever you want, right? No respect, no decency. You ruin everything wherever you go." Daniel clenched his jaw, his fists tightening involuntarily at his sides. The insinuations, the venom in her tone, were more than just random outbursts. This was calculated, born from prejudice. He had every right to defend himself, but years of experience had taught him the dangers of escalation. He forced himself to remain composed. "Ma'am, it's just a parking spot," he said, still tinged with wariness. "There's no need for all this." Her face twisted in fury as though his calmness insulted her very existence. She stepped closer, invading his personal space with a jabbing finger that almost touched his chest. "Don't you dare tell me what's necessary," she snapped. "People like you don't belong here." You think you can just come into neighborhoods like this and act like you own the place? Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. The anger bubbling inside him was hard to contain, but he knew better than to give in. Looking around, he noticed a few bystanders in the distance, their eyes darting between him and the woman. Some had paused mid-step, clearly interested in the growing confrontation, but hesitant to intervene. "Look," Daniel said, stepping back to create some distance. "I don't want any trouble. I'm just here to grab some groceries. Let's leave it at that." For a moment, it seemed like she might relent. Her chest heaved as she glared at him, and the silence hung thick between them. But then, with a sudden movement, she shoved him hard in the back, sending him stumbling forward. Daniel stumbled forward, barely catching himself before hitting the ground. His breath hitched as he turned around to face the woman, his eyes wide with disbelief. "What is wrong with you?" he demanded, his voice no longer calm but tinged with frustration. The woman, who Daniel now mentally referred to as Martha, stood her ground, her chest heaving as though she were in a fight for her life. Her expression was defiant, even triumphant, as if shoving him had somehow validated her anger. "Don't you dare walk away from me," she snapped, pointing a finger at him with a ferocity that seemed out of place for the situation. Daniel raised his hands placatingly, his mind racing to find a way to de-escalate. But Martha was relentless. She took another step forward, her voice dripping with venom. "You people always think you can get away with anything. Well, not today." The phrase "you people" hit Daniel like a slap in the face, sharper than any physical blow could ever be. His fists clenched instinctively, his nails digging into his palms. He could feel his pulse quickening, the adrenaline surging through his veins. Years of experience had taught him that encounters like this rarely ended well for someone like him. Taking a deep breath, Daniel forced himself to speak evenly. "Lady, you need to back off. I'm not here for this nonsense. It's a parking spot, nothing more." But his calm tone only seemed to enrage her further. Her face contorted, her lips curling into a sneer as she closed the remaining distance between them. "Don't you tell me what to do, boy." The word hung in the air, heavy with implication. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He glanced around again and noticed that the crowd of onlookers had grown. Some whispered to each other, while others had their phones out recording. This is not good, Daniel thought, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had seen situations like this before, how quickly the narrative could shift, especially when people like him were involved. "Lady, I'm warning you," Daniel said, his voice lowering into a controlled but firm tone. "Walk away before you do something you'll regret." Martha, however, seemed impervious to reason. Instead of backing down, she lashed out, her hands swinging through the air with alarming speed. The slap landed square on Daniel's face, echoing through the parking lot. For a moment, the world seemed to freeze. The sting on Daniel's cheek burned hot, not just from the impact, but from the sheer humiliation of being struck in public. His jaw tightened and his hands twitched at his sides as he fought the urge to react. But then something inside him shifted. He had done everything he could to avoid this, stay calm and de-escalate. And yet, she had crossed the line. Daniel raised his hand without thinking and delivered a slap in return, not with the same force but firm enough to send a clear message. "No more." Martha staggered back, her hand flying to her cheek as if she couldn't believe what had just happened. Her eyes widened, and for a brief second there was silence. Then, as if on cue, she exploded. "You hit me!" she screamed, her voice shrill and unhinged. "You animal! You'll pay for this. Do you even know who I am?" Her words spilled out in a rapid, chaotic stream, each one louder than the last. She waved her arms dramatically, gesturing wildly at the growing crowd. "He assaulted me," she shrieked, pointing an accusatory finger at Daniel. "This thug thinks he can hit a woman. He's done for." Daniel's chest heaved as he tried to steady his breathing. He felt the weight of the bystanders' stares, their judgment forming in real time. The narrative was shifting, just as he feared it would. "You hit me first," Daniel said, his voice cold but steady. "I didn't want any trouble, but you left me no choice." Martha's face turned an even deeper shade of red as she clutched her cheek dramatically, her lips curling into a sneer. "You'll regret this," she hissed, her voice venomous. "I'll ruin you." Daniel shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "I've got nothing to say to you," he muttered, turning to walk away. As he made his way toward the store entrance, her voice continued to echo behind him, loud and furious. "You hear me? You're finished." The automatic doors of the supermarket slid open, and Daniel stepped inside, the cool air conditioning a stark contrast to the heat of the confrontation he had just left behind. He grabbed a shopping cart, his knuckles white as he gripped the handle. His cheek still stung from her slap, and more than that, the weight of her words lingered, pressing down on him like a heavy stone. He moved through the aisles mechanically, his mind replaying the incident over and over. Every insult, every gesture, it was all etched into his memory like a film on a loop. He could still feel the humiliation, the sting of her hand against his skin, and the venom in her voice as she called him boy. But more than anything, he hated the fact that he had been pushed to the point of reacting. He knew what it would look like, how it would be twisted against him. No one would care about the context, the shove, the slap. All they would see was him, a black man retaliating against a white woman. He placed a loaf of bread into his cart, his hands trembling slightly. This wasn't just about the parking spot anymore. It wasn't even about the slap. It was about the years of prejudice, the constant battle to be seen as equal, to be treated as human. And yet, despite everything, Daniel knew this was far from over. Daniel navigated the aisles of the supermarket, trying to focus on the items on his list: bread, milk, and eggs. The mundane task should have grounded him, but his mind refused to let go of what had just happened in the parking lot. The slap still stung, not just physically but emotionally. It wasn't just about that one moment. It was about everything it represented. Years of enduring microaggressions and blatant racism, all boiling over into this one volatile encounter. As he reached for a carton of milk, his hand hesitated midair. His mind replayed Martha's venomous words, "You don't belong here. You people ruin everything." The sheer audacity of her entitlement was staggering. It wasn't just a bad day for her. This was ingrained hatred casually unleashed in a parking lot over something as trivial as a parking space. Daniel shook his head, trying to push the thoughts aside. He needed to focus on getting his groceries and getting out of there. But even as he continued through the store, every movement felt mechanical, every interaction with other shoppers tinged with an uneasy tension. Were they watching him? Judging him? Finally, he finished his shopping and made his way to the checkout line. The cashier, a young woman with a warm smile, greeted him cheerfully. "Hi there. Did you find everything you needed today?" Daniel nodded curtly, forcing a polite smile. "Yeah, thanks." As he swiped his card and gathered his bags, the knot in his stomach tightened. He dreaded stepping back outside, unsure of what he might encounter. Was Martha still there, waiting for him? Had she already caused more trouble? Taking a deep breath, Daniel exited the store, the automatic doors sliding shut behind him. The parking lot stretched out in front of him, chaotic as ever. But his eyes immediately zeroed in on his car, and his heart sank. From where he stood, he could see deep, jagged scratches running along the side of his car. The pristine paint had been gouged as though someone had taken a key and dragged it viciously across the surface. Daniel's steps quickened as he approached, his fists clenching tighter with every stride. When he reached the car, the full extent of the damage became clear. The scratches were deliberately fresh. The paint had been chipped away, leaving long, white streaks that marred the otherwise smooth surface. Daniel ran his hand along the damage, his jaw tightening. There was no doubt in his mind who had done this. Martha. She must have done it while he was inside the store, probably reveling in the thought of getting the last word. A bitter laugh escaped Daniel's lips as he stepped back to take in the damage. Of course, he muttered to himself. It wasn't enough for her to insult him, shove him, or slap him. She had to leave a tangible mark, a reminder of her disdain. As he stood there trying to decide what to do next, he heard laughter. The sound was sharp, cruel, and unmistakably familiar. Turning his head, he spotted her. Martha, leaning casually against her SUV a few cars away, watching him with a smug expression. "Oh, poor you," she called out, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. "Looks like someone messed up your car. Guess you shouldn't have taken my spot, huh?" Daniel stared at her, his anger bubbling just beneath the surface. His hands trembled, not with fear but with the effort it took to contain himself. He had never been one to lash out, but Martha's smugness was like gasoline on an already blazing fire. "You think this is funny?" he asked, his voice low but steady. Martha laughed again, louder this time. "Oh, I think it's hilarious," she replied, crossing her arms over her chest. "What are you going to do about it? Call the cops? Good luck with that. They'll just arrest you and take my side. You people never learn." The blatant provocation made Daniel's blood boil. His pulse quickened, and for a moment he considered walking up to her, saying something, anything, that might wipe that smug grin off her face. But before he could act, Martha smirked and climbed into her SUV. For a split second, Daniel thought she might just drive away. But then, without warning, she slammed the car into reverse and backed straight into the front bumper of his car. The crunch of metal against metal echoed through the parking lot. Daniel's eyes widened in shock as he watched her SUV collide with his car, the force of the impact leaving a visible dent. Martha leaned out of her window, her grin widening. "Oops," she said mockingly. And then, as if nothing had happened, she shifted into drive and sped off, leaving Daniel standing in stunned silence. For a moment, he didn't move. His mind struggled to process what had just happened. The damage to his car was now undeniable, with scratches and dents and the whole front bumper crushed in. This wasn't just petty vindictiveness anymore. This was malicious destruction. His hands shook as he reached for his phone. He couldn't let her get away with this. Not this time. Dialing 911, Daniel tried to steady his voice as the operator answered. "I'd like to report an incident," he said, his tone tight with barely contained frustration. "A woman just intentionally hit my car and drove off. I'm following her now." The operator asked for details, and Daniel quickly described Martha's SUV. The make, the model, and the license plate. Keeping a safe distance, he tailed her as she weaved through the quiet suburban streets. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the wheel, adrenaline coursing through his veins. As much as he hated to admit it, her taunts echoed in his mind. What if she's right? What if the police don't take my side? He had seen it happen before. How quickly the narrative could shift, how easily the victim could become the accused. But this time, Daniel reminded himself that there were witnesses. There was damage. There was enough evidence to prove what she had done. After a few minutes, flashing red and blue lights appeared ahead. A police car had intercepted Martha at a red light. Daniel exhaled in relief, his hands finally relaxing their grip on the steering wheel. Pulling over to the side of the road, Daniel parked a short distance behind her SUV. For a moment, he stayed in his car, trying to collect himself. His heart pounded, but there was no turning back now. Daniel sat in his car, the sound of his heartbeat pounding in his ears. The flashing red and blue lights reflected in his rearview mirror, illuminating the growing tension he felt. Martha's SUV was pulled over a few feet ahead, and through her side window he could see her flailing her arms dramatically, her voice carrying faintly through the air. "Here we go," Daniel muttered to himself as he stepped out of his car. He needed to stay calm. Any show of anger or frustration could be used against him, and he knew exactly how people like Martha played the game. Bookmark. Go back. A tall police officer with a firm but neutral expression approached Daniel. The badge on his chest read Officer Reynolds. His eyes briefly scanned Daniel before speaking. "Are you the one who called this in?" "Yes," Daniel said, nodding. "That woman," he gestured toward Martha's SUV, "intentionally hit my car in the parking lot and drove off. She's been harassing me since I arrived at the store." Reynolds tilted his head slightly, studying Daniel's face. "What kind of harassment are we talking about?" "She started yelling at me over a parking spot," Daniel explained, his voice steady but firm. "She shoved me, slapped me, keyed my car, and then rammed into it before speeding off." Reynolds raised an eyebrow but didn't react otherwise. He scribbled a few notes onto a small pad before motioning for Daniel to stay where he was. "Wait here," he said before turning and heading toward Martha's vehicle. From where he stood, Daniel could see Martha already mid-rant, her hands gesturing wildly as she shouted at another officer, a petite woman standing by the SUV. Martha's voice was loud enough for Daniel to catch snippets of her tirade. "He attacked me. I was just trying to defend myself." Martha cried, her tone dripping with indignation. "You can't believe anything he says. He's dangerous." Daniel's fists clenched at his sides, but he forced himself to take a deep breath. He needed to trust that the officers would see through her performance. After a few minutes of back and forth with Martha, Officer Reynolds returned to Daniel. His expression was calm, but gave nothing away. "She's claiming you attacked her first," he said, his tone neutral. "Can you tell me exactly what happened?" Daniel took another deep breath and recounted the events as clearly as he could. Arriving at the parking lot, the argument over the parking space, Martha's escalating aggression, and the damage to his car. "There were witnesses in the parking lot," Daniel added, "and I'm sure the store has security cameras that would show what happened." Reynolds nodded, making more notes. "We'll check the cameras. For now, I'd like to see the damage to your car." Daniel led the officer back to his vehicle, where the scratches and dents were still painfully visible. Reynolds crouched down to inspect the bumper, running his fingers along the fresh scrapes. "This is recent," he said, glancing up at Daniel. "Exactly," Daniel replied. "She did that before driving off." Reynolds straightened and turned toward Martha's SUV, where the other officer was still speaking with her. Martha's voice had reached a fever pitch. "This is insane," she screeched. "I'm the victim here. That man attacked me, and now you're treating me like a criminal." The officer by Martha's side spoke calmly but firmly. "Ma'am, please lower your voice and step out of the vehicle." Martha's eyes darted between the two officers, her expression a mix of disbelief and fury. "You can't be serious," she shouted, slamming her hands against the steering wheel. "This is outrageous. I demand you arrest him right now." "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am," Reynolds repeated, his tone more authoritative this time. Finally, Martha threw open her door and climbed out, her face red and twisted with rage. She pointed a shaking finger at Daniel. "This is all his fault," she spat. "You people are always causing trouble. You can't trust them." Daniel bit the inside of his cheek, forcing himself to stay silent. This was exactly what she wanted, for him to lose his cool and confirm every stereotype she was trying to pin on him. Reynolds exchanged a glance with the other officer, then turned back to Martha. "Ma'am, we'll need you to stay here while we review the evidence. For now, please keep your hands to yourself." Martha huffed, crossing her arms over her chest. "This is discrimination," she declared, her voice trembling with anger. Reynolds didn't respond, instead motioning for Daniel to join him a few steps away. "We'll take this one step at a time," he said quietly. "If the security footage corroborates your story, we'll proceed with charges against her. In the meantime, do you want to press charges for the property damage?" Daniel didn't hesitate. "Absolutely." "Understood," Reynolds replied. "We'll start with that. We'll also document the assault allegations, but it may come down to your word against hers unless the footage covers everything." As they spoke, Martha's voice erupted again, shrill and indignant. "This is a setup. You're all against me." Reynolds sighed and walked back toward her. The other officer had retrieved handcuffs and was trying to explain the situation, but Martha wasn't having it. She lunged forward suddenly, her fists swinging wildly, and for a brief moment, Daniel thought she might actually attack him again. "Ma'am, stop," Reynolds barked, stepping in to grab her arms. "You think you can ruin me?" Martha screamed, struggling against the officers as they restrained her. "You'll regret this. I'll have your jobs. I'll sue all of you." The officers worked quickly to subdue her, securing the handcuffs around her wrists as she continued to thrash and shout. "You're nothing," she yelled at Daniel, her eyes blazing with fury. "You don't belong here." Daniel took a step back, his heart pounding. He watched as the officers led her toward the squad car, her screams echoing through the quiet neighborhood. As the police car pulled away, Officer Reynolds returned to Daniel. His expression softened slightly. "Are you all right?" Daniel nodded, though his voice was strained. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just exhausted." Reynolds handed him a card. "You'll need to follow up at the station to finalize your statement. We'll also reach out once we review the footage. For now, try to get some rest." Daniel managed a small nod. "Thank you." As Reynolds walked away, Daniel stood alone beside his damaged car, the weight of the day pressing heavily on his shoulders. The next morning, Daniel Carter pulled into the parking lot of the local police station, his chest heavy with a mix of determination and unease. The events of the previous day lingered in his mind like a storm cloud. Martha's venomous words, her escalating aggression, and the blatant destruction of his car. He hadn't slept much, his thoughts racing as he replayed each moment, second-guessing every choice he had made. But now, standing before the station's glass doors, Daniel knew what he had to do. He couldn't let this go. Not this time. Martha had pushed too far, and he owed it to himself to see this through to the end. Inside, the station was quieter than he expected. The faint hum of computers and the low murmur of conversations filled the air, a stark contrast to the chaos of the parking lot incident. Daniel approached the front desk, where a young officer with short-cropped hair looked up from her screen. "Good morning," she said with a polite but professional smile. "How can I help you?" Daniel cleared his throat, his voice steady despite the tension building in his chest. "I'm here to press charges," he said. "There was an incident yesterday, assault and property damage. I gave a statement at the scene, but I want to follow through with formal charges." The officer nodded, reaching for a clipboard and a pen. "I understand. Please fill out this form with your information, and we'll have someone assist you shortly." Taking the clipboard, Daniel moved to a nearby chair and sat down. The form was straightforward: name, contact details, and a brief description of the incident. As he wrote, his mind drifted back to Martha's face, the unrelenting rage in her eyes, the sheer entitlement in her voice. When he finished the form, Daniel returned it to the desk. The officer glanced over it briefly before nodding. "Someone will be out to see you in just a moment," she said. Daniel nodded, stepping back to wait. His hands were tucked into his jacket pockets, his fingers absently tapping against the fabric. He hated being here, not because he didn't believe in justice, but because of the memories it stirred. He had been in stations like this before as a bystander or a victim, and too often he had left feeling unseen, unheard. "Mr. Carter?" The voice pulled him from his thoughts. Turning, he saw a familiar face, Officer Reynolds. The tall officer who had been there the day before was now approaching him with a clipboard in hand. "Yes, that's me," Daniel said, stepping forward. "Good to see you again," Reynolds said, his tone professional but slightly warmer than the day before. "Come with me. We'll get everything finalized." Reynolds led Daniel down a hallway to a small office at the back of the station. The room was simple, just a desk, a few chairs, and a computer. Reynolds gestured for Daniel to take a seat while he settled behind the desk. "Okay," Reynolds began, pulling up a file on his computer. "Let's start by reviewing your statement from yesterday. Once that's done, we'll discuss the charges and next steps." Daniel nodded, sitting up straighter. He recounted the events again, carefully detailing every interaction with Martha, from her initial shouting in the parking lot to the physical assault, the damage to his car, and her eventual collision before driving off. Reynolds listened intently, typing as Daniel spoke. When Daniel finished, Reynolds looked up, his gaze steady. "It matches what you told us yesterday," he said. "And we've already reviewed some of the security footage from the parking lot. It clearly shows her scratching your car and hitting it with her vehicle." Hearing that confirmation brought a sense of relief, but it was fleeting. Daniel's thoughts immediately turned to the courtroom. "What happens now?" he asked. Reynolds leaned back in his chair. "The report will be sent to the district attorney's office. They'll review the evidence and decide how to proceed with charges. Based on what we have, your statement, the damage to your car, and the witness accounts, it's a strong case for assault and property damage." Daniel exhaled slowly, the weight of the officer's words settling over him. "And what about her?" he asked. "Is she still in custody?" Reynolds nodded. "She's here for her arraignment this morning. If the DA decides to press charges, she'll have a court date set soon." As if on cue, a sudden commotion erupted in the hallway outside the office. Daniel recognized the voice immediately, sharp and shrill. "You can't do this to me." His stomach tightened as the door to the office swung open, and there she was, Martha, her face flushed with anger, her eyes wild with fury. She was flanked by another officer who was struggling to keep her restrained. The sight of Daniel only seemed to enrage her further. "You," she screamed, lunging forward. "You're trying to destroy my life. This is all your fault." The officer beside her tightened his grip, pulling her back. "Ma'am, calm down," he said firmly. But Martha wasn't listening. Her eyes burned with hatred as she pointed at Daniel, her voice rising to a fever pitch. "I'll ruin you. Do you think you're going to get away with this? You're nothing. Nothing. Daniel stood, his heart pounding. Reynolds stepped between them, his hand raised in a calming gesture. "Ma'am, that's enough," he said, his tone sharp. "You need to step back and let us do our job." Martha glared at him, her chest heaving. "This is a setup," she shouted. "You're all in on it. I won't let you ruin me." The other officer managed to drag her out of the office, her screams echoing down the hallway until the door swung shut behind her. Reynolds turned back to Daniel, shaking his head. "I didn't expect her to be brought in this early," he said with a sigh. Daniel sat back down slowly, his nerves still on edge. "Does she even realize what she's done?" he asked, his voice low. Reynolds gave him a small, sympathetic smile. "People like her don't see things the way we do," he said. "But don't worry. She's not going anywhere. Once we finalize the charges, she'll be facing more than just an arraignment." Daniel nodded, though the tension in his chest remained. He couldn't shake the image of Martha's face, twisted with rage and hatred. "All right," Reynolds continued, his tone shifting back to business. "We'll submit everything, and you'll be notified when the case moves forward. You've done the right thing by coming here, Mr. Carter." "Thanks," Daniel said, shaking the officer's hand. "I appreciate it." As Daniel left the station and stepped out into the crisp morning air, he felt a strange mixture of relief and unease. He had taken the first step toward justice, but he knew this was only the beginning. The weeks leading up to the trial were a whirlwind of emotions for Daniel Carter. On the surface, life carried on as usual: work, errands, and the small, everyday moments that made up his routine. But underneath, a storm raged. The confrontation with Martha replayed endlessly in his mind, her insults echoing louder than any of her physical actions. He often found himself staring at the scratches and dents on his car, which were still awaiting repair. Every time he looked at them, he felt a surge of anger, not just at Martha, but at the broader injustices her actions symbolized. He hated that people like her moved through the world so brazenly, with the belief that their entitlement and prejudice would shield them from consequences. One evening, as Daniel sat at his kitchen table sorting through the documents the police had given him, his phone buzzed. It was an email from the district attorney's office. He opened it quickly, scanning the contents. The message confirmed the court date and included instructions for him to prepare his testimony. Daniel leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. He had never been part of a legal case before, much less one where he was both a victim and a key witness. The thought of standing in a courtroom recounting every ugly detail of that day filled him with dread. The next day, he received a call from the prosecutor assigned to the case, a sharp and focused attorney named Valerie Hayes. Her voice was calm but confident as she explained the process. "Mr. Carter," she began, "I've reviewed the evidence, including the security footage and witness statements. This is a strong case, but it's important that we're thorough when presenting it in court." Daniel nodded, though she couldn't see him. "I understand," he replied. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to be clear and consistent," Valerie said. "Tell the truth, exactly as it happened. The jury will see through any attempts by the defense to twist the narrative, but your credibility will be key. Martha Thompson's attorney will try to paint this as a misunderstanding or claim it was mutual aggression. We need to show that's not the case." Daniel's jaw tightened at the thought of Martha continuing to play the victim. "She started everything," he said, his voice firm. "I only reacted to defend myself." "I know," Valerie said. "And that's what we'll focus on. Your actions were measured, and the evidence supports that." Over the next few days, Daniel worked closely with Valerie to prepare. They reviewed his statement, went over the security footage, and even practiced potential questions he might face during cross-examination. Valerie was meticulous, pointing out small details that might strengthen his testimony and advising him on how to remain composed under pressure. "You're doing great," she told him after one particularly grueling practice session. "Just remember, this is about showing the truth. Let the evidence speak for itself." Despite her reassurances, Daniel couldn't shake his nerves. The trial wasn't just about the legal consequences for Martha. It was about something much bigger. It was about standing up for himself in a world that so often tried to push him down. The night before the trial, Daniel sat alone in his living room, a cup of tea growing cold on the table in front of him. He stared at his reflection in the darkened window, his mind swirling with memories of that day. He thought about the bystanders who had watched the altercation but hadn't intervened until things escalated. He thought about Martha's smug grin as she keyed his car and her venomous words as she screamed at him in front of the police. Most of all, he thought about the years of similar encounters he had endured. Subtle slights, overt insults, and the constant effort to stay calm, to not let the world see his anger. This trial wasn't just for him, he realized. It was for every moment he had been made to feel less than, for every person who had been in his position and hadn't had the chance to fight back. The morning of the trial arrived faster than Daniel expected. He dressed carefully, choosing a suit and tie that made him feel confident, but not overly formal. As he stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the knot of his tie, he took a deep breath. "You can do this," he murmured to himself. "You've got the truth on your side." When he arrived at the courthouse, the atmosphere was tense but quiet. The building was imposing, its stone walls and tall columns giving it an air of authority. Daniel walked up the steps, his heart pounding with each step. Inside, Valerie greeted him with a firm handshake. "You ready?" she asked. "As ready as I'll ever be," Daniel replied, forcing a small smile. They entered the courtroom together, where the judge, jury, and a handful of onlookers were already seated. At the defense table, Martha sat with her lawyer, her face pale but her jaw set in stubborn defiance. She didn't look at Daniel, instead keeping her gaze fixed on the table in front of her. The trial began with opening statements. Valerie was clear and precise, laying out the facts of the case in a way that left no room for doubt. Mr. Carter was simply trying to go about his day, she told the jury. He was harassed, assaulted, and had his property damaged, all without provocation. "We are here today to hold Miss Thompson accountable for her actions." The defense, in contrast, leaned heavily on emotion. Martha's lawyer described her as a devoted mother, an upstanding member of the community who had been caught up in a moment of frustration. He painted Daniel's reaction as excessive, claiming the incident was a misunderstanding that had spiraled out of control. Daniel's stomach churned as he listened, but he kept his face neutral. He knew this was just the beginning. When Valerie called him to the stand, Daniel rose and walked to the witness box, his heart pounding. He took the oath and sat down, his hands folded tightly in his lap. Valerie began her questioning, guiding Daniel through his testimony with the same calm precision she had shown during their preparation. He described the events of that day in detail, his voice steady despite the memories threatening to overwhelm him. "Did you at any point provoke Miss Thompson?" Valerie asked. "No," Daniel replied firmly. "I tried to walk away, but she wouldn't let it go. She shoved me, slapped me, and damaged my car. I only reacted to defend myself." As he spoke, he noticed the jurors watching him intently. Some nodded slightly, their expressions serious but empathetic. By the time Valerie finished her questioning, Daniel felt a small flicker of relief. He had told the truth, and now it was up to the jury to see it. The courtroom was tense as Martha Thompson approached the witness stand. She walked with measured steps, her shoulders squared and her head held high as though she believed her presence alone could sway the jury. But Daniel Carter, seated quietly at the plaintiff's table, noticed the subtle twitch in her jaw and the way her hands clenched the railing as she sat down. Once she was sworn in, Martha's lawyer, an older man with a polished demeanor, rose to begin his questioning. His voice was calm, almost soothing, as though he were trying to reassure the jury of Martha's innocence before she even spoke. "Miss Thompson," he began, "can you describe what happened on the day of the incident in your own words?" Martha nodded, her expression softening into one of carefully measured regret. "It was a very stressful day," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I'd been running errands all morning, and by the time I got to the store, I was exhausted. When I saw the parking spot, I thought I could finally take a break. But then Mr. Carter just pulled in, right in front of me. I had my blinker on and everything." Daniel fought the urge to roll his eyes. Her tone was calculated, and the hint of vulnerability was designed to appeal to the jury's sympathies. "And how did you feel when that happened?" her lawyer asked. "I was frustrated," Martha admitted, glancing briefly at the jury. "But I never meant for things to escalate the way they did. I just wanted to talk to him to explain why I was upset." "But he?" Her voice broke slightly, and she took a dramatic pause, clutching her hands together. He started yelling at me. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, and Daniel's jaw tightened. That was a blatant lie, but he knew better than to react. He had to trust that Valerie Hayes, his attorney, would handle this. And then what happened? Martha's lawyer prompted gently. Martha sighed, her expression becoming one of wounded innocence. I tried to stand my ground, she said. I'll admit I got emotional, but he slapped me. Right there in the parking lot. Her lawyer frowned, his expression grave. You're saying Mr. Carter slapped you first? Yes, Martha said firmly. I was so shocked, I couldn't believe it. I know I shouldn't have reacted the way I did, but I was scared. It all happened so fast. At the plaintiff's table, Valerie leaned in slightly, her sharp eyes focused on Martha as she continued her performance. Thank you, Miss Thompson, her lawyer said, stepping back to give her an encouraging nod. No further questions, Your Honor. The judge turned to Valerie. Your witness. Valerie rose smoothly, her expression calm but steely. She approached the witness stand with measured steps, carrying an air of quiet authority that made the room seem smaller. Miss Thompson, Valerie began, her voice steady, you've testified that Mr. Carter slapped you first. Is that correct? Go back. Yes, Martha replied, lifting her chin slightly. Valerie paused for a moment, letting the silence hang in the air. Then she stepped closer. Isn't it also true that you shoved Mr. Carter before any physical contact occurred? Martha's composure faltered for a split second, her eyes darting toward her lawyer. I was trying to get his attention, she stammered. So you admit to initiating physical contact, Valerie pressed, her tone unwavering. Martha shifted in her seat. I wasn't trying to hurt him, she said. It was just a little push. Valerie raised an eyebrow. A little push that caused him to stumble forward. Is that correct? Martha didn't answer immediately. Her silence speaks volumes. Valerie turned to the jury, her voice growing more authoritative. Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard testimony from both sides, but let's focus on the facts. Miss Thompson admits to shoving Mr. Carter first. Witnesses have testified that she also slapped him before he reacted. And let's not forget the security footage that shows her damaging his vehicle. Objection. Martha's lawyer called out. The defense has not had the opportunity to address the footage. Sustained, the judge said, her gavel striking lightly. Valerie nodded, unperturbed. She shifted her focus back to Martha. Let's talk about the damage to Mr. Carter's car, she said. You've testified that you were upset. Did that anger lead you to key his car? I didn't, Martha started, but Valerie cut her off. The footage clearly shows you dragging your keys along the side of his vehicle, Valerie said firmly. Would you like to revise your statement? Martha's face flushed red, and her hands gripped the edges of the stand. I wasn't thinking, she muttered. It was a mistake. A mistake? Valerie repeated, her voice laced with incredulity. And was it also a mistake when you backed your SUV into Mr. Carter's car before fleeing the scene? Martha's lawyer stood again. Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is badgering the witness. The judge raised a hand. Overruled. Miss Hayes, you may continue. Valerie turned back to Martha, her gaze sharp. Miss Thompson, at what point did you intend to take responsibility for your actions? Was it when you screamed at Mr. Carter in the parking lot? When did you physically attack him? Or when you intentionally damaged his property? The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Martha opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. No further questions, Your Honor, Valerie said, stepping back to her table. As Martha left the stand, her head bowed slightly. Daniel felt a flicker of satisfaction. For the first time, her veneer of control had cracked, and the truth was finally shining through. The courtroom settled into a tense hush as the trial entered its final stage. All the testimonies had been heard, the evidence presented, and now it was time for each side to make their closing arguments. Daniel Carter sat at the plaintiff's table, his hands clasped tightly together, the weight of the past weeks pressing heavily on his shoulders. Across the room, Martha Thompson sat with her lawyer. Her defiant demeanor had softened, replaced by a veneer of quiet indignation, but Daniel could still see the flicker of anger in her eyes. She wasn't sorry for what she had done, only sorry that she had been caught. Valerie Hayes rose first, her posture confident and poised as she approached the jury. She paused for a moment, letting the silence build before she began. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, she said, her voice clear and resolute. "What we have witnessed throughout this trial is a story of entitlement, aggression, and a refusal to take accountability. Mr. Carter, a man going about his day like any of us, was subjected to harassment, physical assault, and significant damage to his property, all because Miss Thompson felt she was entitled to a parking space." Valerie gestured toward Daniel, her tone softening slightly. Mr. Carter tried to defuse the situation. He walked away, even after being insulted and shoved. But Miss Thompson escalated, striking him and continuing to provoke him, all while believing she could get away with it. She even went so far as to damage his car and then flee the scene. The jurors listened intently, some nodding slightly. Valerie turned her focus back to them, her expression earnest. "This case isn't just about a parking lot dispute. It's about a pattern of behavior that Miss Thompson herself admitted to during her testimony. She initiated physical contact. She keyed Mr. Carter's car. She backed her vehicle into his and then fled. These are not the actions of someone who made a single mistake. These are the actions of someone who believes the rules don't apply to them." Valerie stepped closer to the jury box, her voice lowering slightly to emphasize her next point. Mr. Carter didn't ask for this confrontation. He didn't seek out this conflict. But when faced with it, he acted with restraint and composure, even under extreme provocation. The evidence supports his account. The witnesses corroborate his story. And the footage leaves no room for doubt. She straightened, her gaze sweeping across the room. Miss Thompson must be held accountable for her actions. Anything less would send a message that this kind of behavior is acceptable, that one person's entitlement can overshadow another's dignity and rights. "I urge you to deliver a verdict that reflects the truth we have seen and heard in this courtroom. Thank you." Valerie returned to her seat, and Daniel felt a sense of pride in how clearly and passionately she had defended his case. Next, Martha's lawyer rose. He adjusted his tie, his demeanor calm and measured as he approached the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth, "this case is about perspective. Yes, mistakes were made. Yes, emotions ran high. But we must remember that my client, Miss Thompson, is a human being, a mother, a community member, who is having a very difficult day." He gestured toward Martha, who lowered her gaze, her expression carefully arranged to convey regret. "Miss Thompson has admitted that she allowed her frustration to get the better of her. She has taken responsibility for keying Mr. Carter's car and for the collision. But let us not forget that this was a situation that escalated on both sides." The lawyer's voice softened as he addressed the jury. "Ask yourselves this. Was Miss Thompson truly acting out of malice, or was she responding to a tense situation that spiraled out of control? My client regrets her actions deeply, but she was also provoked. Mr. Carter slapped her, a detail that cannot be ignored, regardless of the circumstances." Daniel clenched his jaw, resisting the urge to react. He knew this was coming, the attempt to paint him as equally responsible, but it still stung to hear his justified response twisted into an act of aggression. The defense attorney continued, his tone almost pleading. "This isn't about excusing bad behavior. It's about understanding that we all have moments of weakness. Miss Thompson has already suffered greatly. Her reputation has been tarnished, and her life has been turned upside down. She has learned from this experience, and I ask you to consider that as you deliberate." "Thank you." He returned to his seat, and the courtroom fell silent once more. The judge gave final instructions to the jury, emphasizing their duty to evaluate the case based solely on the evidence presented. Then, they were dismissed to deliberate. Daniel watched as the jurors filed out, their expressions unreadable. He felt a wave of nervous energy course through him. This was it, the moment everything hinged on. Valerie leaned over, her voice low but firm. "You did great, Daniel. Now we wait." Minutes felt like hours as Daniel sat in the quiet courtroom. He avoided looking at Martha, focusing instead on the polished wood of the table in front of him. His thoughts churned, alternating between hope and dread. Finally, the jury returned. The courtroom buzzed with quiet anticipation as everyone took their seats. "Have you reached a verdict?" the judge asked. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, stood and nodded. "We have, Your Honor." Daniel held his breath as the verdict was read aloud. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Martha Thompson, guilty of assault and property damage." A collective murmur rippled through the room. Martha's face paled, her carefully constructed composure crumbling. She stared straight ahead, her hands trembling slightly as the reality of the verdict sank in. Daniel exhaled slowly, the weight of weeks of tension lifting just slightly. Justice had been served, at least in part. The judge's gavel struck lightly, signaling the courtroom's dismissal. But the sound reverberated in Daniel Carter's mind like a final punctuation mark to weeks of tension. The words guilty of assault and property damage lingered in the air, bringing with them a mixture of relief and lingering bitterness. Daniel remained seated for a moment, staring ahead as the murmurs and movement around him grew louder. The weight of the verdict began to settle in, but instead of feeling victorious, he felt something quieter, more subdued. Justice had been served, but it hadn't erased the sting of what Martha had done or the deeper issues her actions represented. Across the courtroom, Martha Thompson sat frozen in her chair, her pale face betraying a range of emotions: anger, disbelief, and beneath it all, the faintest trace of fear. She turned briefly toward Daniel, her expression a mixture of defiance and desperation, but he refused to meet her gaze. As the bailiff escorted Martha from the room, her protests began again. "This isn't over," she shouted, her voice echoing through the quiet space. "I'll appeal. You'll regret this." Daniel didn't flinch. He had heard those threats before, and he doubted they were anything more than empty words, but her venom still stung. Even now, Martha refuses to take responsibility for her actions, clinging instead to her entitlement and rage. Valerie Hayes approached him, her expression both professional and kind. "You did well, Daniel," she said softly, resting a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "The jury saw the truth. That's what matters." Daniel nodded, though his thoughts were elsewhere. He looked down at the polished wood of the plaintiff's table, his reflection staring back at him. "I know," he replied, his voice low. "I just wish it didn't have to come to this." Valerie gave him a small, understanding smile. "You stood up for yourself," she said, "and for others who've been in your position. That's no small thing." He managed a faint smile in return. "Thanks for everything you did. I couldn't have gotten through this without you." "You're welcome," she said. "And if you need anything, follow-ups, support, anything at all, don't hesitate to reach out." With that, she gathered her notes and left, leaving Daniel alone with his thoughts. As he walked out of the courthouse, the cold morning air hit him like a cleansing wave. He paused on the steps, closing his eyes and taking a deep breath. The world outside seemed so normal, cars passing, people walking by, oblivious to the storm he had been weathering for weeks. But as much as he wanted to feel a sense of closure, there was a lingering bitterness he couldn't shake. The scratches and dents on his car had been repaired, but they had left an imprint on his mind that no amount of polish could erase. Martha's actions hadn't just damaged his property, they had attacked his dignity. She had tried to humiliate him, reduce him to nothing more than a stereotype, and in many ways, that hurt more than any physical blow. Justice had been served, but Daniel couldn't ignore the fact that it had taken weeks of effort, emotional exhaustion, and a court case just to hold someone accountable for their blatant wrongdoing. And even then, Martha's entitlement remained unchecked, her hatred as sharp as ever. As Daniel began the walk to his car, his thoughts turned inward. This trial had been about more than just him. It was about the countless other moments he had endured, the subtle digs, the judgmental stares, the constant effort to prove that he belonged. He thought about his parents and the stories they used to tell him when he was younger, about their own struggles with racism. They had always told him to keep his head high, to be twice as good and twice as calm, because people like Martha would always try to tear him down. But it was exhausting. No amount of calmness or composure could erase the anger simmering beneath the surface. Daniel hated that people like Martha moved through the world so easily, their entitlement shielding them from consequences most of the time. Even now, after her guilty verdict, Daniel knew that people like her didn't just disappear. They were everywhere, hiding behind polite smiles or unleashing their hatred the moment they felt their power was threatened. He reached his car and paused, his reflection staring back at him in the driver's side window. He looked at himself, really looked, and saw a man who was tired, not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually. Why does it have to be this way? he murmured to himself. He got into the car and sat there for a moment, the engine off, the silence heavy around him. The courthouse behind him was a symbol of justice, but it couldn't erase the deeper issues that people like Martha represented. Her actions were just one instance in a long line of injustices that Daniel and others like him had to face every day. And while he had won this battle, he knew the fight wasn't over. Valerie's words echoed in his mind. You stood up for yourself, and that's no small thing. He let out a long breath, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Maybe she was right. Maybe standing up was all he could do. One confrontation, one victory at a time. As he started the car and pulled out of the courthouse parking lot, Daniel resolved to keep moving forward. He didn't know what the future held or when the next challenge would come, but he knew this much. He wouldn't let people like Martha define him. Justice had been served today, but the larger fight for equality, dignity, and the right to exist without fear was far from over. As the day wore on and Daniel Carter left the courthouse behind, the weight of the experience lingered. His victory in court, while significant, felt like only a small dent in a much larger problem. The trial had brought justice to one incident, but it also exposed the deeply rooted issues of prejudice and entitlement that still permeated society. Reflecting on his journey, Daniel couldn't help but think about the countless others who faced similar injustices, but lacked the resources, witnesses, or even the courage to stand up for themselves. His case wasn't just about Martha Thompson or the parking lot. It was a stark reminder of the inequalities that people of color face every day, both subtle and overt. Martha's actions were not unique. They were symptomatic of a broader entitlement and privilege that allowed her to feel justified in harassing, assaulting, and damaging someone else's property without considering the consequences. Her rage wasn't just about a parking spot. It was about power, control, and the societal structures that enabled her to act as she did. For Daniel, the trial was a lesson in resilience. It reminded him that standing up for oneself requires not only courage, but also emotional strength and an unwavering belief in one's right to exist with dignity. He had endured insults, physical aggression, and systemic challenges, yet he chose to confront them with grace and determination. The courtroom victory was satisfying, but it didn't erase the sting of the initial confrontation or the exhaustion that came with fighting for what should have been inherently his: respect and equality. Daniel realized that the fight for justice isn't about one singular victory, but about the collective progress made through each small step. The story of Daniel Carter and Martha Thompson serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of accountability. It shows that entitlement and hatred, when unchecked, can escalate into violence and destruction, but also that standing up to these forces can inspire change. It is a story of resilience and justice, but it is also a call to action for all of us to examine our own biases and behaviors. If this story moves you, we want to hear your thoughts. Was it inspiring? Did it give you a new perspective on the challenges others face? If you thought the story was good, comment with a 1. If you thought it was amazing, comment with a 2. And we'd love to know about your own experiences. Have you ever faced a moment where standing up for yourself felt like the hardest but most necessary thing to do? Share your story in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss more meaningful stories like this one. Let's keep the conversation going because every voice matters, and together, we can build a better understanding of each other's journeys. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's inspire each other to be better, one story at a time.